Dyatlov Pass Incident. The mystery of 9 hikers who vanished into the snow one night in early February 1959, deep within the remote Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. Freezing winds swept across endless snow-covered ridges. The temperature had fallen to nearly -30 degrees Celsius. In a place where almost no human beings lived, a single tent stood alone on the side of a mountain. Inside that tent, 9 hikers were resting after a long day of travel. They were young, experienced, healthy, and well-trained in surviving some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Yet within only a few hours, everything would change. The tent would be cut open from the inside. Boots and winter clothing would be left behind, and every person inside would flee into the darkness. None of them would survive. More than 60 years later, the world continues to ask the same question. What happened on that mountain? What occurred during one of the quietest and most mysterious nights in modern history? This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. If you enjoy stories of history, tragedy, and real events that changed the world, welcome to Missing History. Let's uncover the past, one story at a time. The Expedition. In late January 1959, a group of experienced hikers and university students from the city of Sverdlovsk set out on an expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. There were 10 members in total. Leading the group was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student known for his discipline, leadership, and mountaineering skills. He planned the entire route and earned the complete trust of every member of the team. Years later, the mountain pass where the tragedy occurred would be named Dyatlov Pass in his honor. Among the group was Zinaida Kolmogorova, a cheerful 22-year-old woman beloved by her friends. According to diaries later recovered from the expedition, she was known for her laughter and her ability to keep everyone's spirits high. Another member was Rustem Slobodin, a strong and athletic engineering student who loved sports and adventure. Yuri Doroshenko had earned a reputation among fellow hikers after surviving a dangerous encounter with a wild bear during an earlier expedition. Georgy Krivonishenko was a young engineer who had worked on Soviet nuclear-related projects. Alexander Kolevatov was a quiet physics student respected for his intelligence and calm reasoning. Lyudmila Dubinina, only 20 years old, was the youngest member of the team, yet she was admired for her determination and endurance. Nikolai Thibault-Brignot was known for his exceptional physical strength. And finally, there was Semyon Zolotaryov. At 38 years old, he was the oldest member of the expedition, a decorated veteran of the Second World War. Many would later describe him as the most mysterious member of the group, but among all 10 travelers, only one would survive. His name was Yuri Yudin. During the early stages of the expedition, severe joint pain and health problems forced him to turn back. At the time, he was devastated. He waved goodbye to his friends, believing he would see them again within a few weeks. He never did. For the rest of his life, Yuri Yudin often said that returning home that day was the only reason he remained alive. The last days on the mountain. As the expedition pushed deeper into the northern Urals, the landscape became increasingly isolated. Dense forests, vast snowfields, and mountains constantly battered by icy winds. Despite the harsh conditions, morale remained high. We know this because investigators later recovered diaries and rolls of film left behind by the hikers. The group took turns writing journal entries. Some were simple jokes, others contained playful teasing between friends. Some described the exhaustion of the journey, but none of them suggested fear. None hinted that anything was wrong. The photographs told the same story. The hikers can be seen marching through deep snow, laughing together, sharing meals, helping one another drag equipment up steep slopes. Those smiles would later become some of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the entire case, because they showed that until the very last hours, everything appeared normal. Then came February 1st, 1959. The weather began to deteriorate. The wind grew stronger. Snowfall intensified. Visibility steadily decreased. The group was heading toward Mount Outoten, the primary objective of the expedition, but during the storm, they drifted off course. Instead of reaching a sheltered valley where they could camp safely, they found themselves on the exposed slope of a mountain called Kholat Syakul. In the language of the indigenous Mansi people, the name is often translated as Mountain of the Dead. Although the name sounds ominous, it was simply an old geographical term. No curse, no legend, no supernatural reputation. Yet on that night, the mountain would become the setting for one of history's greatest mysteries. The final photographs recovered from the expedition appear to show the group setting up camp on the exposed mountainside. They dug into the snow to create a stable platform for their tent, prepared dinner, changed clothes, and settled in for the night. No one knew that within a few hours, every person inside that tent would face something so frightening that they would abandon their only shelter and step out into darkness and temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius, never to return. The silence begins. According to the expedition plan, Igor Dyatlov had informed his institute that the group would return around mid-February. Upon reaching their destination, they were expected to send a telegram. A delay of a day or two was considered normal, especially on difficult routes through the Ural Mountains. So when no message arrived, nobody worried at first. 1 day passed, then 2, then 3. Concern slowly began to grow. Families started contacting the university. Questions were asked. Soon, pressure from parents and friends led to the organization of a search effort. At first, the search teams consisted primarily of students and volunteers. Many of them were friends of the missing hikers. As the search expanded, Soviet military personnel and rescue units joined the operation. Helicopters began scanning the mountains from above. Ground teams searched valleys and ridges below. Days passed without success. Then, on February 26, 1959, searchers spotted something on the slope of Kholat Syakul, a tent, the final shelter of the Dyatlov group. As they approached, they immediately sensed that something was wrong. The tent was still standing, partially buried in snow, but completely empty. No voices, no movement, no sign of life, only silence. Inside were winter clothes, boots, food, cameras, and most of the group's equipment. Everything appeared to have been abandoned suddenly, as though the occupants had left without warning. Then came the most shocking discovery. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not from the outside, from the inside. The hikers had not used the entrance. Instead, they had slashed through the fabric and escaped directly into the freezing darkness. Why? What could have frightened experienced mountaineers enough to abandon their only protection against the deadly cold? The mystery had begun. The final footprints in the snow. After discovering the abandoned tent on the mountainside, search teams began following the trail of footprints leading away from the campsite. Although several weeks had passed since the night of the incident, the extreme cold had preserved portions of the tracks. The footprints descended the slope and continued toward a forest roughly 1.5 kilometers away. What investigators found unusual was that many of the tracks did not appear to be made by people running in panic. Instead, they seemed to indicate a hurried walk. It was as though the hikers had deliberately left the tent and were trying to put distance between themselves and the campsite as quickly as possible. The trail eventually led searchers to a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. Several branches on the lower part of the tree had been broken. Some were located several meters above the ground. The damage suggested that someone had climbed the tree, possibly attempting to look back toward the tent. Beneath the cedar, searchers made their first grim discovery. 2 bodies lay near the remains of a small campfire. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko. Both were inadequately dressed for the extreme cold. Evidence suggested they had attempted to build a fire and survive through the night. But the freezing temperatures had proven too powerful. Autopsies later concluded that both men had died from hypothermia. Yet the most heartbreaking discoveries were still to come. Between the cedar tree and the tent, search teams found 3 more bodies. The first was Igor Dyatlov himself. The expedition leader lay face down in the snow. One hand was clenched tightly, as though he had been struggling in his final moments. His position suggested that he had been attempting to return to the tent. Not far away, investigators discovered Zinaida Kolmogorova. She too was facing toward the campsite, as if she had been desperately trying to make her way back to safety. Further along the same path lay Rustem Slobodin. Like the others, he appeared to have been moving toward the tent when he collapsed. A tragic picture began to emerge. After leaving the tent, the group had likely gathered beneath the cedar tree. They built a fire. They attempted to survive. And at some point, several members decided to return to the tent to retrieve desperately needed clothing and supplies. None of them made it, but the mystery was far from over. 4 members of the expedition were still missing, and what investigators would discover months later would transform the case from a tragic accident into one of the greatest mysteries of the modern era. The 4 bodies and the mystery that refused to die. In May of 1959, as the snow finally began to melt, search teams returned to continue looking for the 4 missing hikers. Nearly 3 months had passed since the tent had been discovered. Then, deep within a ravine, approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree, investigators found what they had been searching for. Beneath several meters of snow lay the bodies of Alexander Kolovatov, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoy. What they found shocked everyone. Unlike the first 5 victims, these 4 had suffered severe traumatic injuries. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoy had sustained a major skull fracture. Both Semyon Zolotaryov and Lyudmila Dubinina had multiple broken ribs. The force involved was extraordinary. Medical examiners compared it to injuries typically seen in high-speed vehicle collisions. Yet there was something deeply puzzling. The victims displayed very little external damage. No signs of a brutal assault, no major wounds, no evidence of weapons. It was as though an immense force had crushed them from within. For investigators, this became one of the most difficult aspects of the case to explain. Then came another disturbing discovery. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. Several victims were also missing eyes and portions of facial tissue. The details quickly fueled rumors and speculation. Some believed the hikers had encountered something unknown. Others suspected a government cover-up. But modern forensic experts offer a far more conventional explanation. The bodies had remained buried beneath snow and exposed to flowing water for months. Soft tissues such as eyes, lips, and tongues are often among the first parts of a body to decompose or be consumed by scavenging animals. While the injuries appeared horrifying, they did not necessarily point toward anything supernatural. Yet another mystery remained. Investigators detected traces of radioactive contamination on some articles of clothing. The word radiation alone was enough to inspire countless theories. Secret military tests, experimental weapons, nuclear accidents. But despite decades of speculation, no direct evidence has ever linked the incident to a Soviet military operation. Some researchers point out that several members of the expedition had previously worked in environments connected to the Soviet nuclear industry. The contamination may have existed before the journey even began. Still, the questions persisted, and the mystery only grew deeper. The theories. Since 1959, countless explanations have been proposed for what happened on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. Scientists, historians, journalists, writers, and amateur investigators have all attempted to answer the same question. Why did 9 experienced hikers leave their tent and walk into a deadly winter night? Even after more than 6 decades, no single theory explains every detail. The first and most widely accepted theory is known as the slab avalanche theory. According to this explanation, the hikers may have unintentionally destabilized a section of snow while preparing their campsite. Hours later, accumulated snow and strong winds could have triggered a compact slab of snow to slide onto the tent, not a massive avalanche. Not the kind often seen in movies, but a smaller movement of snow, capable of causing injuries and convincing the group that greater danger was imminent. Fearing a larger collapse, they may have evacuated the tent immediately. Supporters of this theory point out that it explains why the hikers cut their way out of the tent and fled into the darkness. However, critics note that investigators found little evidence of a major avalanche at the site. This remains one of the biggest points of debate. Another theory involves a phenomenon known as infrasound. Some researchers suggest that powerful winds moving across the mountain ridge may have generated low-frequency sound waves. These sounds are below the threshold of human hearing. Yet some studies suggest they may contribute to feelings of anxiety, discomfort, or panic. According to this theory, the hikers may have experienced an overwhelming sense of fear without understanding why. However, evidence supporting this explanation remains limited. A third theory involves secret Soviet military testing. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union conducted numerous classified projects. Some speculate that the hikers may have unknowingly entered an area where experimental weapons were being tested. Supporters point to the unusual injuries, the traces of radiation, and reports of glowing orange objects seen in the sky around the time of the incident. Yet, despite decades of investigation, no documents have emerged proving that military testing occurred in the area that night. Then there are reports of mysterious orange lights. Several witnesses claim to have seen glowing objects moving through the night sky. Some believe they were experimental rockets. Others suggest they were natural atmospheric phenomena. And for some, they remain one of the most intriguing elements of the entire mystery. Finally, there are theories involving UFOs and the paranormal. Over the years, books, documentaries, and internet discussions have proposed everything from extraterrestrial encounters to supernatural forces. While these explanations remain popular among mystery enthusiasts, no credible evidence has ever supported them. And that is the heart of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Every theory explains part of the story, but none explain everything. We know they left the tent. We know they tried to survive. We know some attempted to return. and we know that none of them made it. But the event that set everything in motion remains uncertain. A truth that may never be known. For more than 60 years, the name Dyatlov Pass has continued to appear in books, documentaries, research papers, and conversations around the world. Despite all the investigations, one question still remains. What happened on that mountain on the night of February 1st, 1959? In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case using modern scientific methods. Their goal was not to investigate paranormal theories. Instead, they sought the most realistic explanation, supported by evidence. Researchers examined weather records, terrain data, autopsy reports, search documents, photographs, and sophisticated computer simulations of snow movement. Their conclusion pointed once again toward a slab avalanche. According to their findings, the hikers may have unknowingly weakened the snowpack while preparing their campsite. Hours later, strong winds could have increased pressure on the slope until a section of snow shifted. Some members may have been injured. The group may have believed a larger collapse was imminent, and in the darkness, they chose to leave the tent immediately. From there, a series of tragic decisions followed. They sought shelter in the forest, built a fire, attempted to survive. Some tried to return to the tent. Others succumbed to injuries and exposure. For Russian investigators, this explanation best fits the available evidence. Yet many people remain unconvinced. Questions still linger. Why did the group leave without adequate clothing? Why did they separate? Why do certain details remain so difficult to explain? Perhaps we now understand how they died, but we may never know exactly what they were thinking during their final hours, and perhaps that uncertainty is why the mystery continues to captivate the world. The winds still blow across the Ural Mountains. Snow continues to fall on the slopes of Kolat-Syakhl, just as it did in 1959. The footprints from that night have long since vanished. Only photographs remain, a handful of diary entries, and questions that may never be answered. The 9 hikers were not reckless adventurers. They were young people with dreams, with families, with futures, lives that were still unfolding before everything came to an abrupt end on a remote mountainside. Perhaps the reason this case continues to fascinate us is not because of UFOs or conspiracy theories. Perhaps it is because it reminds us how powerful nature can be, and how, even when we possess a great deal of evidence, the complete truth can still remain just beyond our reach. To this day, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the most famous mysteries in modern history. And somewhere beneath the silent snow of Kolat-Syakhl, there may still be answers waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps they were buried forever on that cold winter night. This was the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, the mystery of 9 hikers who walked into a snowstorm and never returned. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to explore more remarkable stories from the past, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and joining us again for another journey into history. Until next time, this is Missing History. Thank you for watching.